Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of rural Ireland. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In January of 1891, the Cork Examiner printed a brief notice about a tragic accident in County Kerry, deep in the isolated farmlands of the Dingle Peninsula. The article, barely 4 paragraphs long, reported that a young farmer named Cormac Brennan had fallen from a hayloft and broken his neck. The newspaper noted that his devoted sister Siobhan had discovered the body and raised the alarm, and that the local doctor had ruled the death accidental. The article concluded by extending condolences to the Brennan family, which had already suffered the loss of both parents in the preceding months. What the newspaper failed to mention was that this brief report would eventually be connected to a pattern of deaths so calculated and so coldly executed that it would become one of the most chilling cases of domestic murder in Irish history. The Brennan family had been respectable farmers, known throughout the parish for their modest prosperity and quiet devotion to their land and faith. Within the span of 4 months, every member of that family would be dead except for one, the daughter who had nursed them all through their final illnesses, who had wept at their funerals, and who had inherited everything they possessed. The story that follows is assembled from county records, coroner reports, trial transcripts preserved in the Cork archives, newspaper accounts from the Cork Examiner and the Kerry Evening Post, and testimonies given to the Royal Irish Constabulary during their investigation. Some records were thought lost until their recovery during courthouse renovations in 1967, providing details that cast the case in an even more disturbing light. As the winter of 1891 settled over the hills of Kerry, no one yet suspected that Siobhan Brennan had been planning something far more sinister than mourning. Her devotion concealed a darkness that would haunt the parish for generations to come. The Dingle Peninsula in County Kerry was among the most remote and rugged regions in all of Ireland during the latter half of the 19th century. Surrounded by the cold waters of the Atlantic and dominated by the Slivemish Mountains, the land was beautiful but unforgiving. Farms clung to hillsides and narrow valleys, separated by miles of bog and rough pasture. Roads were little more than dirt tracks that turned to mud in the frequent rains, and travel to the nearest market town could take the better part of a day. Life here was dictated by the seasons, by the health of livestock, and by the yield of potato and oat crops that sustained families through long winters. Under British rule, Irish tenant farmers faced heavy rents and constant uncertainty, making land ownership a precious achievement and inheritance the single most important event in a family's continuity. Those who held their own land, however modest, enjoyed a measure of security and respect that their neighbors could only envy. The Brennan family had farmed approximately 30 acres of decent land in a townland called Ballinvoher, situated about 8 miles northeast of Dingle Town. Patrick Brennan had inherited the farm from his father and worked it alongside his wife Bridget, a woman from a neighboring parish who had brought a small but respectable dowry to their marriage in 1848. Together, they raised 3 children in a stone cottage with a thatched roof and a small barn for their cattle and sheep. Cormac, born in 1882, was the eldest and heir apparent to the farm. Siobhan followed in 1896, the only daughter, expected to assist her mother in household duties until a suitable match could be arranged. Declan, the youngest, arrived in 1871 and showed more interest in the wider world than in the daily labors of farm life. The Brennans were regarded as respectable people in the parish. They attended Mass faithfully, paid their debts promptly, and kept their land in good order. Patrick served as a selector for the local agricultural show, and Bridget was known for her skill in butter making. Neighbors considered them fortunate, a family blessed with health, modest prosperity, and 3 living children in a time when such blessings were never guaranteed. Siobhan Brennan was 24 years old in the autumn of 1890, and by the standards of rural Ireland, she was approaching the age when prospects for marriage grew dim. In the harsh calculus of farm life, daughters occupied a precarious position. They provided essential labor in the household, cooking and cleaning and mending, tending to poultry and dairy, nursing the sick, and caring for the elderly. Yet, unlike their brothers, they could not inherit land. Their future depended entirely on the willingness of their fathers to provide a dowry and the luck of attracting a suitable match. Those who did not marry faced a grim set of alternatives: remaining in the family home as unpaid servants to a brother and his wife, entering domestic service in a wealthy household, emigrating to America or England to find work, or in the worst cases, ending their days in the county workhouse. Siobhan had watched girls she knew from childhood leave the parish one by one, some to marriages in neighboring townlands, others to boats departing from Cove for Boston or New York. She remained at Ballinvoher, her days consumed by duties that would never earn her independence or security. Neighbors who knew her described Siobhan as a capable and hard-working young woman. Mary Clifford, whose farm bordered the Brennan property to the north, recalled her as quiet, but not unfriendly, always proper in her manner and attentive to her parents' needs. She kept a clean house and was skilled in cookery, particularly in preparing broths and herbal remedies when illness visited the household. Others noted that she rarely smiled and seemed to carry a heaviness about her, though none thought this unusual given the burdens she bore. Father Donnelly, the parish priest at Ballinvoher Chapel, would later provide testimony that cast Siobhan's character in a different light. He noted that she attended Mass without fail and received communion regularly, but what struck him most was her frequency at confession. She came weekly, sometimes more often, and her confessions were lengthy and fervent. He could not reveal what she confessed, but he acknowledged that her devotion seemed driven by something deeper than ordinary piety, something that troubled her soul in ways he did not fully understand until it was far too late. Cormac Brennan was 28 years old in 1890 and had long been groomed to inherit the family farm. He was a sturdy man, with his father's build and his mother's practical disposition, well regarded in the parish as a hard worker and a reliable neighbor. Unlike his younger brother Declan, who spoke openly of emigrating to America, Cormac had never shown any desire to leave Ballinvoher. The land was his birthright and his future, and by the summer of 1890 he had begun courting a young woman named Eileen O'Sullivan from the townland of Kilquane, approximately 4 miles to the east. Eileen was 22, the daughter of a farmer with 40 acres of good land and a reputation for shrewd dealings. The match was advantageous for both families. Eileen would bring a dowry of 15 pounds and 2 heifers, a respectable sum that reflected her father's approval of Cormac as a son-in-law. The Brennans welcomed the courtship with enthusiasm. Patrick spoke approvingly of Eileen's people at the public house in Dingle, and Bridget began making plans for the wedding feast. A spring marriage was agreed upon after the worst of winter had passed, and the farm work allowed time for celebration. For Siobhan, her brother's courtship carried implications that no one in the family openly discussed. Once Eileen O'Sullivan became mistress of the Brennan household, Siobhan's position would change entirely. She would no longer manage the kitchen and dairy, but would answer to her brother's wife in all domestic matters. Her labor would still be expected, but her authority would vanish. Worse, her continued presence would depend on Eileen's tolerance and Cormac's willingness to maintain an unmarried sister under his roof. If the new wife found her burdensome, or if children came quickly and space grew scarce, Siobhan could find herself pushed out with nothing but a small sum and nowhere to go. Neighbors later recalled that Siobhan grew unusually quiet during the months of Cormac's courtship. Mary Clifford noted that she seemed distracted after Mass and rarely lingered to speak with other women as she once had. Thomas Mahoney, a laborer who worked occasionally on the Brennan farm, observed that she spent increasing time at the chapel, sometimes sitting alone in the empty church for an hour or more in the dim afternoon light. In the second week of October 1890, Patrick Brennan fell ill with what the family initially believed to be a common stomach complaint. He had been feeling poorly for several days, suffering from nausea and cramping that he attributed to something he had eaten. Such ailments were not unusual in rural Kerry, where food preservation was imperfect and contaminated water could strike down even the healthiest of men. Bridget prepared her usual remedies, broths and herbal teas meant to settle the stomach, but Patrick did not improve. After 3 days of worsening symptoms, Cormac rode to Dingle to fetch Dr. Fitzpatrick. The doctor arrived on the afternoon of October 14th and examined Patrick in the back bedroom, where he lay pale and weakened. Dr. Fitzpatrick noted severe gastric distress, vomiting, and signs of dehydration, but he saw no cause for alarm beyond the immediate illness. Patrick was 58 years old and had complained of digestive troubles in recent months, which the doctor attributed to the natural decline of age and the harsh realities of farm labor. He prescribed rest and clear liquids and advised the family to send for him again if the patient did not improve within a day or two. Siobhan took charge of nursing her father, preparing his meals and sitting by his bedside through the nights. Neighbors later recalled her devotion during this period, how she refused offers of help and insisted on bearing the burden herself. Despite her efforts, Patrick Brennan died on the morning of October 17, 1890, with his wife and daughter at his side. Dr. Fitzpatrick signed the death certificate, listing the cause as gastric fever, and expressed his condolences to the grieving family. The funeral was held 3 days later at Ballinvohare Chapel, with Father Donnelly presiding over a well-attended Mass. Patrick had been respected in the parish, and neighbors came from miles around to pay their respects and offer comfort to his widow and children. The farm passed to Cormac as expected, under the customary laws of inheritance. But with Bridget still living and capable, the daily arrangements of the household remained unchanged. Siobhan continued in her duties as before, and life on the Brennan farm carried on through the darkening days of autumn. Less than 3 weeks after Patrick Brennan was laid to rest in the parish cemetery, his widow Bridget began to show signs of illness. It started with fatigue and loss of appetite, which the family attributed to grief. Bridget had been married to Patrick for over 30 years, and the shock of his sudden death had left her withdrawn and tearful. But as November progressed, her condition worsened in ways that could not be explained by sorrow alone. She developed stomach pains similar to those that had afflicted her husband, followed by episodes of vomiting that left her weak and bedridden. Siobhan once again assumed complete responsibility for nursing duties, preparing all of her mother's meals and administering herbal remedies meant to ease her suffering. When neighbors called to offer assistance, Siobhan thanked them graciously but declined their help. Mary Clifford brought a pot of broth and offered to sit with Bridget through the night, but Siobhan insisted that she could manage alone. It was her duty as a daughter, she explained, and she would not burden others with her family's troubles. Dr. Fitzpatrick was summoned twice during the month of November. On his first visit, he found Bridget weak but not critically ill, and he suggested that her symptoms were likely the result of grief compounded by the cold and damp of the season. He prescribed rest and nourishment and advised Siobhan to keep her mother warm and comfortable. When he returned a week later, Bridget had declined significantly. She could not keep food down and had grown so feeble that she could barely sit up in bed. The doctor expressed concern, but saw no specific cause for her deterioration. He told Cormac privately that sometimes the old simply lost the will to live after losing a spouse, and that there was little medicine could do in such cases. Bridget Brennan died on the morning of December 3rd, 1890, with Siobhan holding her hand and reciting prayers for the dying. Father Donnelly administered last rites and presided over her funeral 4 days later. 2 parents dead within 6 weeks struck the parish as tragic, but such losses were not unprecedented in rural Ireland, where illness moved swiftly and grief could hasten the end. No one yet suspected that anything was amiss. With both parents in the ground before Christmas, Cormac Brennan became master of the family farm at the age of 28. He bore his grief with the stoic resolve expected of men in his position, focusing on the work that needed doing and the future that lay ahead. His wedding to Eileen O'Sullivan was postponed out of respect for the mourning period, but both families agreed that a spring ceremony would still be appropriate. Life had to continue despite loss, and a wife would bring stability to a household that had suffered so much upheaval. Cormac spent the early weeks of January tending to the winter tasks of the farm, repairing fences and tools, caring for livestock, and preparing for the lambing season that would come with the first warmth of spring. Siobhan kept the house as she always had, cooking meals and maintaining the domestic routines that held their diminished family together. To neighbors who inquired, she seemed devoted to her brother's welfare, ensuring he was well fed and properly cared for as he shouldered the burdens of the farm alone. On the morning of January 14th, 1891, Siobhan came running from the barn, screaming for help. Thomas Mahoney, who was passing on the road, heard her cries and rushed to the property. He found her kneeling beside her brother's body on the hard-packed floor of the barn beneath the hayloft. Cormac lay motionless, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle and blood pooling beneath his head. Siobhan was hysterical, sobbing that she had found him like this and could not wake him. Mahoney sent for Dr. Fitzpatrick immediately, but by the time the doctor arrived, it was clear that Cormac had been dead for some time. Dr. Fitzpatrick examined the body and found injuries entirely consistent with a fall from the hayloft, a broken neck, and severe trauma to the skull where it had struck the ground. The ladder to the loft was old, and some rungs were worn smooth from years of use. Accidental death was recorded without hesitation, and the community once again gathered to mourn another Brennan laid to rest in the parish cemetery. Siobhan was inconsolable at the funeral, supported by neighbors as she wept over the brother who had been taken so suddenly. She was now alone on the farm with only Declan, her younger brother, who had been working as a laborer on a larger estate some miles away. The death of Cormac Brennan created a crisis of inheritance that would determine the fate of everyone connected to the family farm. Under Irish custom and law, the land should pass to Declan as the sole surviving son, but this presumption carried complications that the family had never anticipated. Declan was only 19 years old and had shown little interest in the grinding labor of farm life. For the past 2 years, he had worked as a hired laborer on a large estate near Tralee, sending money home when he could, but making no secret of his desire to leave Ireland altogether. He spoke openly of cousins who had emigrated to Boston and found work in the factories and rail yards, earning wages that would take a lifetime to accumulate on a small Kerry farm. America represented possibility and freedom, while Ballinvoher meant only endless toil on 30 acres of rocky soil. The financial realities of the situation were stark. Whoever inherited the farm controlled not only the land, but also the household and everyone in it. If Declan chose to emigrate, he would likely sell the property and take the proceeds with him, leaving Siobhan with nothing but whatever small sum he might spare for her maintenance. She would be a woman of 24 with no husband, no home, and no means of supporting herself beyond domestic service or the charity of distant relations. If Declan chose to stay and work the land, he would eventually marry and bring a wife into the household, placing Siobhan in precisely the subordinate position she had dreaded under Cormac's intended bride. Either path led to dependency and diminishment. Records from the land office in Tralee show that inquiries were made about the Brennan property in the weeks following Cormac's death. A solicitor acting on behalf of a neighboring farmer asked about the status of the title and whether the land might soon come up for sale. Word had spread that young Declan Brennan had no intention of remaining in Kerry, and there were men with capital who saw opportunity in the family's misfortune. For Siobhan, watching these maneuverings from the farmhouse where she had spent her entire life, the future must have seemed a closing trap from which there was no honorable escape. The farm that had sustained her family for generations now threatened to cast her out entirely. Declan Brennan returned to Ballinvoher 2 days after his brother's funeral, having received word of the death while working on the estate near Tralee. He was 19 years old and found himself suddenly the sole male heir to a farm he had never wanted and a household marked by tragedy. Neighbors who saw him arrive noted that he looked overwhelmed by the weight of his new circumstances, a young man more accustomed to taking orders than giving them, now thrust into a position of authority he had never sought. Siobhan welcomed her brother home with the attentive care she had shown to every member of her family. She prepared his favorite meals, kept the fire burning warmly against the January cold, and spoke gently of practical matters that would need his attention in the coming weeks. To those who observed them together, she seemed the devoted sister doing everything in her power to ease her brother's burden during a difficult time. Declan, for his part, appeared uncomfortable in the farmhouse where he had grown up, restless in a way that suggested he was already looking beyond the hills of Kerry to somewhere far away. Within a week of his return, Declan began visiting the public house in Dingle, where he confided his intentions to men he had known since childhood. He told them plainly that he meant to sell the farm as soon as the legal matters could be settled and use the money to book passage to Boston. He had cousins there who would help him find work, and he saw no future for himself in Ireland. The land held nothing but graves and hard labor, and he wanted no part of it. He spoke of leaving by summer, if all went well. Word of Declan's plans traveled quickly through the parish, as such news always did in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. It reached Siobhan within days, though no one could say exactly who told her or how she first received the information. Mary Clifford, who lived on the neighboring farm, later testified about a conversation she had with Siobhan during this period. They were discussing Declan's intentions when Mary noticed something change in Siobhan's manner. Her expression did not change, Mary recalled, but something in her eyes went very still, like a candle flame in a room where the air has suddenly stopped moving. In the last week of January 1891, Declan Brennan began to complain of stomach pains and nausea that he attributed to something he had eaten at the public house in Dingle. Siobhan expressed concern immediately and insisted that he rest while she prepared a broth to settle his stomach. Over the following day, his condition deteriorated rapidly. The stomach pains grew more severe, accompanied by violent episodes of vomiting that left him pale and trembling. He developed a thirst he could not quench and a weakness in his limbs that confined him to bed. Siobhan sent word to Dr. Fitzpatrick in Dingle, urging him to come as quickly as possible. The doctor arrived on the morning of January 28th and examined Declan with growing concern. The young man's symptoms were severe, more acute than a typical stomach ailment, but Dr. Fitzpatrick could identify no specific cause. He suspected a winter fever of unusual virulence or perhaps contaminated food that had introduced some poison into the system. He prescribed rest, clear liquids, and warmth, and he instructed Siobhan to continue preparing broths and teas to keep her brother nourished. She assured him that she would not leave Declan's side until he recovered. Over the next 4 days, Declan's condition worsened despite his sister's devoted care. He grew weaker and more confused, slipping in and out of consciousness and muttering words that made no sense. On the 3rd night, he became delirious, crying out about shadows moving in the corners of the room and clutching at Siobhan's arm as though terrified of something only he could see. She stayed with him through every hour, spooning broth into his mouth and praying aloud for his recovery. Dr. Fitzpatrick returned on January 31st and found the patient near death, his body failing in ways the doctor could not explain or reverse. Declan Brennan died on the morning of February 1st, 1891, with his sister holding his hand and whispering prayers for his departing soul. He was 19 years old. 4 members of the Brennan family had now died within the span of 4 months, leaving Siobhan as the sole survivor. Under the law, with no other heirs living, she inherited everything: the farmhouse, the land, the livestock, and all the family's possessions. The farm that had nearly been sold out from under her was now hers alone. The death of Declan Brennan stirred something in the parish that the previous losses had not. 4 members of a single family dead within 4 months, and the sole survivor was the one person who had stood to lose everything if any of them had lived. Whispers began in the days following the funeral, quiet conversations after Mass, and murmured questions at the market in Dingle. How was it that Siobhan Brennan, who had nursed each of them through their final illnesses, remained in perfect health while everyone around her perished? Why had she refused help from neighbors who offered to share the burden of care? And how convenient that she now owned the farm outright, with no brother to sell it from under her and no sister-in-law to displace her from her own kitchen. Father Donnelly found himself unable to sleep in the nights following Declan's burial. He thought of Siobhan's frequent confessions, her fervent prayers, and the heaviness she had carried for months before the deaths began. He could not reveal what she had told him in the sanctity of the confessional, but he could not quiet the questions that tormented his conscience. Had she confessed intentions he had failed to recognize, or sins he had absolved without understanding their true nature? The seal of confession bound him absolutely, but it could not prevent him from wondering what he might have stopped if he had only listened more carefully. Dr. Fitzpatrick, meanwhile, sat in his surgery reviewing the notes he had made during his visits to the Brennan farm. He compared the symptoms of Patrick, Bridget, and Declan, and he recognized for the first time how remarkably similar they were. All 3 had suffered severe gastric distress, vomiting, weakness, and rapid decline. Cormac's death had been different, an accident with clear physical evidence, but the others formed a pattern that troubled him deeply. He began to consider possibilities he had previously dismissed as unthinkable. The formal request for investigation came from Seamus O'Sullivan, Eileen's father, who had lost both a prospective son-in-law and the union of lands he had anticipated. He wrote to the Royal Irish Constabulary in Tralee, demanding that the deaths be examined by proper authorities. Within a week, Sergeant Michael Byrne was assigned to the case and began his journey to Ballinvoore. Sergeant Michael Byrne arrived in Ballinvoore in the second week of February 1891 and immediately began a methodical investigation into the Brennan deaths. He was a careful man with 15 years of service in the Royal Irish Constabulary, experienced in cases that required patience and attention to detail. He started by interviewing neighbors, asking questions about the family's circumstances, the timing of each death, and any observations that might have seemed insignificant at the time. He spoke with Mary Clifford, Thomas Mahoney, and others who had known the Brennans, building a picture of a household where one person had controlled access to all food and medicine during every fatal illness. He then reviewed Dr. Fitzpatrick's medical notes and confirmed what the doctor himself had begun to suspect. The symptoms of Patrick, Bridget, and Declan Brennan were strikingly consistent with one another and consistent with a particular kind of poisoning. The critical evidence came from the apothecary in Dingle. Sergeant Byrne examined purchase records going back a full year and discovered that Siobhan Brennan had bought arsenic-based rat poison on 3 separate occasions between August and December of 1890. Each purchase was modest in quantity but sufficient for its intended purpose. When questioned, The apothecary recalled that Siobhan had explained the purchases by claiming rodent problems in the grain stores and had seemed entirely unremarkable in her manner. Byrne then interviewed neighboring farmers about vermin activity in the area and found no one who recalled unusual rodent problems on the Brennan property or anywhere nearby during the autumn and winter months. The explanation Siobhan had given for her purchases appeared to be a fabrication. Armed with this evidence, Sergeant Byrne requested exhumation of the bodies. The local coroner, Dr. Harrington from Tralee, performed detailed examinations of the remains of Bridget, Cormac, and Declan Brennan. Patrick Brennan's body was also exhumed but had decomposed to a degree that made conclusive testing difficult. Dr. Harrington's findings were damning. He detected significantly elevated levels of arsenic in the tissues of all three later victims, levels far beyond what could be explained by natural causes or environmental exposure. Bridget and Declan showed concentrations consistent with repeated doses administered over several days. Cormac's levels were lower, but still present, suggesting he had been poisoned before his fatal fall from the hayloft. On the morning of March 5, 1891, Sergeant Michael Byrne returned to the Brennan farm accompanied by 2 constables from the Dingle Barracks. He carried with him a warrant for the arrest of Siobhan Brennan on 3 counts of murder, for the deaths of her mother Bridget, her brother Cormac, and her brother Declan. The coroner's findings had provided sufficient evidence for the Crown prosecutor in Tralee to authorize the charges, and the case would be sent forward to the assizes in Cork for trial. Siobhan was in the kitchen when the officers arrived, preparing bread as she had done countless mornings before. She listened to the charges read against her without visible emotion, her hands still dusted with flour as Sergeant Byrne spoke the words that would seal her fate. Neighbors who gathered at the edge of the property to witness the arrest later described her reaction as eerily calm, as though she had been expecting this moment and had made her peace with it long before it came. She thanked the officers for their courtesy and asked only for permission to collect her rosary beads from the bedroom before being taken away. The request was granted, and she emerged moments later with the beads wrapped around her fingers, her lips moving silently in prayer. The community found itself torn by the arrest. Some had harbored suspicions for weeks and felt vindicated by the charges, convinced that only Siobhan could have committed such calculated acts. Others refused to believe that the quiet, pious woman who had attended Mass so faithfully and nursed her family so devotedly was capable of poisoning her own blood. They spoke of her gentleness, her dedication, and her suffering, and they wondered if some terrible mistake had been made. Sergeant Byrne attempted to question Siobhan during the journey to Tralee, but she offered only one statement in response to his inquiries. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice steady and without remorse. God will understand even if you cannot. When informed that a solicitor would be appointed to represent her at trial, she initially refused, saying she needed no advocate but the Almighty. It took the intervention of Father Donnelly, who visited her in the Tralee jail, to persuade her to accept legal counsel for the ordeal ahead. The trial of Siobhan Brennan opened at the Cork Assizes on May 11, 1891, before a packed courtroom and a gallery of journalists from newspapers across Ireland and England. The case had drawn national attention as one of the first major trials in Irish legal history, where forensic evidence of poisoning would prove central to the prosecution. The Crown had assembled a formidable case built on science, records, and testimony, and the public hungered for every detail of the quiet farm woman accused of murdering her own family. Dr. Harrington took the stand on the second day and presented his findings in precise clinical language. He explained the process of exhumation and examination, described the tests he had performed on tissue samples, and stated unequivocally that the remains of Bridget, Cormac, and Declan Brennan contained arsenic levels consistent with deliberate poisoning. He testified that the symptoms described by Dr. Fitzpatrick during each illness matched the known progression of arsenic toxicity, and that such concentrations could not have occurred through natural means or accidental exposure. The apothecary from Dingle followed, producing his ledger books and confirming that Siobhan Brennan had purchased arsenic-based rat poison on 3 occasions in the months preceding the deaths. Neighbors were called to testify about the timing and circumstances of each death, about Siobhan's insistence on nursing her family members alone, and about her demeanor during the months when her world should have been collapsing around her. Mary Clifford described the stillness in Siobhan's eyes when she learned of Declan's plans to sell the farm. Thomas Mahoney recounted finding her beside Cormac's body in the barn. The prosecution painted Siobhan as a calculating killer who had systematically eliminated every family member who stood between her and ownership of the land, a woman who had smiled and prayed while spooning poison into the mouths of those who trusted her most. The defense, a solicitor appointed by the court who had met his client only days before the trial, argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial. He noted that rat poison was commonly purchased by farmers and that the presence of arsenic did not prove who had administered it. He appealed to the jury's sense of propriety, insisting that a devoted daughter and sister who attended Mass faithfully and had nursed her family through illness could not possibly be capable of such monstrous acts. His arguments were passionate, but ultimately futile against the weight of evidence assembled against her. On the 5th day of the trial, Siobhan Brennan took the witness stand to testify in her own defense, a decision her solicitor had advised against but could not prevent. She walked to the stand with her rosary beads clasped in her hands and took the oath with a steady voice that carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. What followed was not a denial of the charges, but a revelation of the psychological depths that had driven her actions, a testimony that would leave the gallery stunned and the jury visibly disturbed. She spoke of her life on the farm with a calmness that belied the horrors she described. She told of years spent in endless labor, cooking and cleaning and nursing and mending, securing the prosperity of a household she could never own. She explained how she had watched her youth slip away while her brothers were groomed for inheritance and independence, knowing that marriage grew less likely with each passing year and that spinsterhood meant a future of dependency, invisibility, and eventual destitution. She described her father as a tyrannical man who viewed her as nothing more than unpaid labor, and her mother as complicit in a system that valued daughters only for what they could provide before being discarded. Her brothers, she testified, cared nothing for her welfare and would have cast her out without a second thought once they no longer needed her services. Cormac would have handed the household to Eileen O'Sullivan, and Siobhan would have become a servant in her own home. Declan would have sold the farm and sailed for America, leaving her with nothing but a few pounds and nowhere to go. I was to be used until I was used up, then cast aside like a worn-out tool, she said, her voice never wavering. I chose differently. She did not weep or plead for mercy. She did not express remorse for the lives she had taken or ask the jury to understand the desperation that had driven her. She simply stated the cold logic of her situation and the solution she had devised to escape it. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as she finished her testimony, and even the prosecutor seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Here was a woman who admitted to murdering her entire family and justified it as a rational response to circumstances that offered her no other path to survival. The judge called a recess to allow the gallery to compose itself before closing arguments began. The jury retired to deliberate on the afternoon of May 15, 1891, and returned to the courtroom in less than 2 hours with their verdict. The foreman stood and pronounced Siobhan Brennan guilty on all 3 counts of murder. A murmur swept through the gallery, though the outcome had surprised no one who had sat through the trial. The evidence had been overwhelming, and her own testimony had removed any lingering doubt about her culpability. The judge, Mr. Justice Harrison, addressed the prisoner before passing sentence. He spoke of the sacred bonds of family that she had violated, of the trust her victims had placed in her care, and of the calculated cruelty with which she had exploited their dependence upon her. He noted that Irish law provided only one penalty for murder, and that he was bound to impose it. Siobhan Brennan was sentenced to death by hanging, the execution to be carried out at Cork Jail within 8 weeks. She received the verdict without visible emotion, crossing herself slowly and murmuring a prayer as the words were spoken. She did not cry out or protest her innocence. She simply bowed her head and allowed herself to be led from the courtroom by the guards who flanked her. Contemporary newspaper coverage of the verdict reflected a society struggling to comprehend what had occurred. The Cork Examiner described her as a monster devoid of natural feeling, while the Freeman's Journal in Dublin took a more measured tone, noting the desperation that had driven her acts, and questioning whether a society that offered women so few paths to independence bore some responsibility for creating such desperate creatures. Letters to editors debated her character and her crimes, with some calling for swift justice and others arguing that her case exposed the cruelties inherent in rural Irish life for unmarried women. Father Donnelly visited Siobhan in Cork Jail during her final weeks, fulfilling his pastoral duties despite his own torment over what he might have prevented. He later wrote in his journal that she expressed no remorse for what she had done and maintained that God would judge her more mercifully than men had. She spent her days in fervent prayer, clutching her rosary beads and reciting devotions from morning until night. Whether she prayed for forgiveness or simply for strength to face what awaited her, she never revealed. Siobhan Brennan was executed at Cork Jail on the morning of July 7, 1891. She walked to the gallows with her rosary beads in her hands and refused the offer of a hood, choosing to meet her end with her eyes open. The hangman later reported that she spoke no final words and showed no fear as the noose was placed around her neck. She was 25 years old. Her execution was one of the last hangings of a woman in Ireland for the crime of murder, and it drew a small crowd of onlookers to the street outside the prison walls, despite the early hour. The Brennan farm in Ballinvoher was sold within months of the execution. Siobhan had no will and no direct heirs, so the proceeds passed to distant cousins in County Clare, who had never met her and wanted nothing to do with the property's dark history. The livestock was auctioned, the furniture dispersed, and the farmhouse eventually fell into disrepair as successive owners struggled to make a living on land that locals whispered was cursed. The case faded from immediate memory as other tragedies and scandals captured public attention, but it never entirely disappeared. It entered the folklore of the Dingle Peninsula, passed down in stories told by firesides and in pubs, a cautionary tale about what could happen when desperation met opportunity. Criminologists and historians who later examined the case struggled to understand what combination of factors had produced such methodical violence. Siobhan Brennan was not insane by any legal or medical definition of the time. She had planned her crimes carefully, acquired the means to commit them without arousing suspicion, and executed them with patience and precision over a period of months. Her actions revealed a mind capable of sustained calculation and emotional detachment. Yet she had lived for 24 years as a dutiful daughter and devout churchgoer without any outward sign of the darkness within. Scholars have compared her case to other instances of domestic poisoning in the Victorian era, noting the particular vulnerability of dependent women who saw murder as their only path to autonomy and security. The Brennan case raises lasting questions about how social constraints can warp the human spirit, how years of powerlessness and resentment can curdle into something monstrous, and how the people we trust most completely are sometimes the ones we should fear. More than a century has passed since Siobhan Brennan walked to the gallows at Cork Jail, yet her story endures in the hills of the Dingle Peninsula where it began. The farmhouse at Bellenvoie fell to ruin decades ago. Its stone walls collapsed and overgrown with brambles. Its roof long since rotted away. The land has been absorbed into neighboring properties, and nothing remains to mark where the Brennan family lived and died, except a slight depression in the earth where the foundations once stood. In the parish cemetery, 4 weathered headstones bear the names of Patrick, Bridget, Cormac, and Declan Brennan, their inscriptions worn nearly smooth by wind and rain. Siobhan was buried in unconsecrated ground within the walls of Cork Jail, her grave unmarked and long since built over by later construction. Modern criminologists continue to study the case as an example of domestic poisoning and the psychology of dependence and resentment. They analyze Siobhan's methodical approach, her ability to maintain a facade of devotion while systematically eliminating her family, and the cold rationality she displayed even in her final testimony. Some see her as a psychopath incapable of genuine emotion, while others view her as a product of circumstances so constrained that violence became the only agency available to her. Unanswered questions persist despite the passage of time. Was Patrick Brennan's death truly natural, or was he the first victim in a plan that Siobhan had already conceived? Did she intend from the beginning to kill everyone who stood between her and the farm, or did each death lead inevitably to the next as her situation grew more desperate? The forensic evidence from 1891 could not provide definitive answers, and Siobhan herself never clarified the full scope of her intentions. Her case remains a window into the harsh realities of women's lives in 19th century rural Ireland, a reminder that violence can emerge from the most intimate spaces and the most trusted hands. Locals in the Dingle Peninsula still speak of strange occurrences at the old Brennan property. Hikers and farmers passing at twilight have reported seeing a woman in dark clothing standing where the farmhouse once stood, motionless and silent, watching the road as if waiting for someone who will never come. Whether these sightings are tricks of light and legend or something more, they suggest that Siobhan Brennan's presence has never entirely left the land she killed to possess.